So constructing the enterprise digital twin. So Suncor, like other companies in the hydrocarbon business, are faced with the need to change the way we do business. And we need to reduce our carbon intensity, reduce costs, diversify our energy holdings. And all this is enabled by a journey to derive real benefits from digitalization in all aspects of our business. In the words of our CEO, Mark Little, in Suncor 4.0, we'll apply digital technologies to accelerate operational excellence. We expect that this will help us achieve world-class performance, generate value, drive and enhance our competitive edge, and create the workplace of the future. So in order to achieve this vision, we need to transform all aspects of our enterprise to drive standardization and integration across all areas of our business. So on the people side, we need to be able to empower people by automating their routine work, simplifying our employee experiences, and allowing people to feel the value that their contribution brings. From a purpose and process perspective, across all of our assets, we need to standardize our processes, execute those processes excellently and repeatedly. From a data perspective, we've got ever increasing amounts of data as information is flowing into our systems. And we must harness that, pull that information together and provide actionable data insight to be able to do that. From a technology perspective, we need to make the technology work for us, simplify the suite of tools, and be consistent in how we apply those. Use technologies that provide integrated value and standardize the use of those tools across the organization. Furthermore, we need to understand how each of these elements, people, process, data, and tech, interact. What is the connections between them, and where are we today, and where do we need to be to make that happen? To accomplish this, Suncor decided we should create our own enterprise digital twin. So just a little bit about some real life sort of digital twins or pairings that talked about. You might recognize these images from Apollo 13, and one dramatic movie and the other one from the actual Apollo 13 mission that it was based on. And there's two good examples of pairing that were inside of there. So I remember this actor coming in, with his arm full of stuff and coming onto the table and just dropping all of these different components on the table and saying, we got to make this square filter fit in this round hole, or all the astronauts are going to die. And so they sat down with all of the stuff that they would have on the actual, module, and they worked through a process and a completion and a construction to make this actual filter that they could use in the field. So this idea of pairing allowed them to create, critical life-saving processes and do that in a no-consequence environment, so they could iterate quickly and change things as they were going through. The second part that happened inside that they showcased in the movie was when they were doing the re-entry drills and trying to create a process where they could actually create the battery drain on the module wasn't so great that it would actually cause them to crash, or the re-entry angle would be wrong, and hence all of the astronauts perish. So those were both excellent examples, were critical for bringing back the astronauts safely, and allowed those teams to work on those solutions to get immediate feedback, iteration, and try out scenarios, and quickly collaborate, utilizing the materials and components that were on hand. It's important to note that in these examples, it was not just the engineering problem. I also mentioned the process pieces. So what's the thing, and what's the process to actually use it, to put those things together? So let's talk a little bit about what is a digital twin. So if we wanted to describe something as alive, we would look for things like growth, reproduction, functional activity, continual change. Similarly, we could look to characteristics that might define a digital twin. From a connectivity perspective, the physical and digital worlds have connections between them. Homogenization, things in the digital world have meaningful representations of what's in the physical world. Reprogrammable and smart, so the physical things have parameters that can be adjusted, changed, and optimized. Digital traces, so the actions that are taken have an audit trail and can be related to the outcomes. Modularity, discrete physical building blocks that can be shifted, retasked, and recombined to optimize value flow that the component participates in. These characteristics are directly applicable to the enterprise, I would argue. Connectivity, as we continue to digitize and move away from paper, more of the information is available in the system. Increasingly, these collection points are being automated to improve the information flow into the system as well. Homogenization, we understand the individual actors, the processes, the data entities, and the applications that participate in our business value streams, and we can represent those as entities in our planning system. Reprogrammable and smart, So the enterprise workstations and people can be retasked and the parameters tweaked within a team in order to optimize productivity and even pivot them into dealing with new lines of business. And digital traces, I mean, just by virtue of connecting and digitalizing our businesses, we get all of that audit information largely for free when we implement those systems. But other logs and other layers that we can put on top will help to feed into that. Modularity. It's interesting that this year's Gartner theme is actually the composable enterprise, which is referring to these self-contained digital business capabilities that can be well-defined and structured and swapped and recombined. The enterprise digital twin is nothing if not a way to describe those component building blocks, their inputs, outputs, and scope of concerns. So you might say, where does Abacus fit into all of this? Well, maybe take you on a bit of a tangent and journey, but in the business world, we started with a barter economy where value was relative to goods being exchanged. Later, we placed value in a token or currency. Now we have that abstracted value from the specific good. We can start to diversify and track this through all the transactions and the business process. And so we created ledger books with columns of values, and then we digitized those into spreadsheets. And next, we added another layer of abstraction by putting that information into databases, organized into rows and columns of information that allowed us to start to think about specific objects and the metadata associated with them. And now Abacus has come along and built on those database concepts and added principles of a graph database where information is conceptualized simply as components and connections. These graph database concepts allow us to fully describe the entities and the relationships between those entities, a core requirement for the enterprise digital twin. Of course, simply having a tool isn't enough to realize the enterprise digital twin. We also need a common language that is understood by all parts of the business. So for this, we leveraged ArchiMate. So with that, we can describe business structure and interactions and even the entire value chain at varying levels of detail. By leveraging these two technologies together, we can create a common language across the architectural domains and even into the business itself, capture that language in a model, and then capture information against it. So I've argued that the enterprise can have all the characteristics to realize an enterprise digital twin. And now we need to figure out how to model what it is that the enterprise does. So what are enterprises made up of? People, processes, technology, data, and assets. These interactions between the objects make organizations run. By using a paradigm like this, we can start to identify the high-level objects that define how work is completed and how profit is generated. To that end, if we start to abstract that idea up, we can start by understanding the value streams that the company creates. These often are very apparent to the business strategy and the executive, so much so that they probably take it for granted. There's physical representation of the value streams. So we've referred to them as the follow the X model here. So as an energy company, we might be looking for follow the molecule or follow the electron, depending on the area of the business that we're trying to track and optimize. And then generally these are represented down in the model and these tie the physical assets to those value chain segments. So there's also the equivalent business models in each of the value chain segments, which describe the various strategies that the business will use to attain the value in that particular segment. And that gives us an understanding of the flow of commodity. So this together gives us an understanding of the flow of commodity currency through the corporation. Inside of each of these models, then we look to understand people, process, technology, and data that are important to realize these value streams. So we started by creating models of the physical assets at a high level to understand how product flows through our facilities and is eventually sold. In order to complete this, we sat down with designated high-level business users across the different areas and mapped solely the large-scale facilities and the flow of materials through those to market. You might notice on this particular model, albeit hard for you guys to read, that we chose not to show the actual materials and instead focused on the flows through the facilities. From a presentation perspective, it's easy to add too much detail through the models and make them harder to comprehend. And in this case, we wanted to limit the viewpoint specifically to the facilities, even though the material connections are hidden in behind. We talk about people. We work primarily with our HR department, and we defined our primary work job families to define the roles. You can see that many of these are links down to more detailed decompositions that exist in the enterprise. And you may have noticed that we introduced some non-human roles here as well. The idea here was to be able to compare now and probably more prevalently into the future the role that machines will have in decision-making in our processes and leaving space for that in the model. Ideally, as we achieve greater levels of automation, we can see a transition of responsibilities from humans to machines for routine decisions. So one other aspect that I wanted to focus on when we're talking about the integrating the people into this as well is bringing in personas. So if there's an emergence here regarding the employee experience and internal personas. So you can integrate those concepts generally by aggregating certain roles and actors into persona concepts, which you can then use for reporting and insights. You can see in this model related to the people breakdowns, the business role as it relates to the business process, aggregation of actor and roles up there to the persona level. This model also talks a little bit about how we specialized the ArchiMate objects to create some through the use of their suggested specializations to the individual and organization components. And then you can see we actually are pulling those from our HR system. So this is just a little model that we put together to map that and show that. So then we talked about the processes. This is probably the biggest effort that we undertook, which was to define our process hierarchy aligned to our value chain as opposed to the functional areas in the organization. Here we again sat down with those business SMEs and discussed their core processes and drove down through the hierarchies with a mandate to capture down 4 levels for the process groups. This gave us enough depth to talk meaningfully about large process areas without getting bogged down in the specific procedures at this point. The decision about what level to go down to is largely arbitrary. I'll be transparent about that, but it was a starting place. And we expect to see some flux there over time regarding what's captured in the system. So from previous efforts, we were also able to leverage as a starting place a lot of the discussions that we had around the processes. A lot more discussion was had about how those processes actually laddered up inside and how the hierarchy was different this time around, so to speak. So that was good. So if we look into the next area, so if we think about our data and what's there, defining common business data for our organization, we group the concepts up at a high enough level so that the concepts remain stable, regardless of what might be changing in our environment. We leveraged an industry model as well for ADRM, and I'd suggest that there's other industry models that you could use as accelerators, or even just look inside of your own data groups to see what it is that they're doing inside of the organization. You may find some of it has already organically grown. So if we then look at the technology components, so we need to connect those applications and technology, which are going to enable processes and people to do, the corporation's work. Similarly to what I mentioned before regarding creating enough abstraction to be stable, this concept for us is more about what the applications actually need to do, not what the specific technology is. But keeping that abstraction layer, we can simplify discussions, look for duplication of functionality, and generally support more of the IT assets for the enterprise. So those are sort of all the individual elements and collecting all that information together, pulling it into one of those places. But one of the characteristics that we talked about was the principle of connectivity, where the model is connected to real world entity and that information, which we've done through that identification. And we're still working on this as well, of course. But I wanted to give you an idea of some of the systems that are relevant to pulling some of these different areas together when we think about that depth. So people for data for Suncor largely resides in our HR systems. So we're pulling that information together. Our process decomposition data is conveniently inside of Abacus with detailed process models and procedures being held in some other systems. Of course, there's also like the documented levels of those as well that exist in paper formats even that are delivered to site. SAP, we expect to be a cornerstone because it's a cornerstone of our process execution that happens at Suncor. And we would expect to see that stuff flow in as well into the future. Since we've chosen to start with ADRM as the beginning point for our data model, we have implemented high enough business level objects in Abacus, and then we use that as the primary for our high level structure. And then we have other systems which we're installing for data quality and master data management, which will align these constructs to complete the operational tasks. So from a technology perspective, our operations group heavily uses ServiceNow. And so generally we've aligned at ServiceNow is through the native connector that exists inside of Abacus. And that's worked really well for us so far. When thinking about the data to connect into your model, that principle that we mentioned before about having concepts that are stable is good to employ here as well. We can attribute these objects in almost any way, but if we go too crazy, it might be hard to spot the relevant trends. So try to stick to those metrics and values that contribute directly to your value chain. Another key principle that we've been pushing in this area is that Abacus is our planning system, and other systems are going to hold that operational day-to-day information. And we'll look to populate those systems to provide us with the updated as-is information. Generally, anything that we're populating in Abacus is about planning, so it's usually for at least the next year coming up. But it's been really important to keep that in mind, because there's lots of thoughts about like, oh, is Abacus just a land grab for all the other systems that I've got in my enterprise? And it's not. It's meant to be. It has a very specific use for the pieces that we're putting in it, we're employing it for. So if we go another level deeper, we talk about a little bit more about the relationships that are going on in between. So from a modeling perspective, we've managed to drill down from those most abstract concepts of the value chain at the organization down into the assets, the business models, and the constituent people, process, tech, and data that make up the execution of the business models. This defines our as-is state for the enterprise. And now if we wanted to drill into change, we can use our current state business models as a baseline for an evolved business model which identifies the assets that are to change. We create specializations of those objects which represent the change state of a particular entity. This is important because those connections allow us to count how many changes are planned against an object, which can give us a heat map then of where we see big changes inside of the organization. So this allows us to look across the enterprise and determine those areas where we see the biggest change impacts and flag those for deeper investigation. As the projects execute and the solution architects build out their models, they can work closely with organizational change management to ensure that all of the planned changes are aligned and positioned for success. So this is one of the ways that we're using the digital twin to identify change, demand, and interdependencies in the organization in order to drive an optimized and structured planning process. By incorporating this as a structured and modeled enterprise, it also allows us to quickly iterate and identify change impacts as the situations change in the organization and plans need to be shifted. Recent events would be, COVID or budget implications, right, with the fluctuating price of oil for us. Similarly, any information that we attribute on the components can be analyzed and collected against the architectural plateau. So that's the architectural plateau, allowing for better decision-making up down the stack. I think we'll see that in the next slide. So yes, here, I wonder if I can hide this because I think it's hiding my little piece there. There we go. So this is an example of the demand model. So you can see here, so this is the demand models that we're using. So we've just created a template. This background is just some images that we've dropped on so that we can define some different areas to work inside of. And you can see around the outside, we can see the components in pink. And these are the change structure sits in the middle here. And then we've got the motivation sort of hanging off on the right here for what's happening. So these components, the model is referencing, the components on these models is referencing the components that we created previously, and even the associated risk domains that the change is associated with. So you can see that down here. For new things, they just appear in the middle for those objects that are changing, and we create the specializations of the objects. So you can see right here, these lines that go back and forth. So those are creating specializations that are inside. And then these demand model concepts are registered against the change plateau. So this is where I was talking about that architectural plateau that they can be associated with. And this is where we would then track. So using that connection that we've got there, we can track against any particular change that we're making, how many changes to a particular object. And then if you look at it coming from the other side, you could pick any one of these individual objects and see how many change plateaus it's actually associated with. If you attribute the dates on here as well for what the targets are, you can actually then see the information flows in the opposite direction. So how many change impacts do you have against any particular object, and how is that flowing back into what you've got? So this has been the journey that we've been on, is building these models out, building this processes out for putting these together. And that hasn't been without some challenges that we've had, and we've had to overcome in some ways. And I think there's a couple things that have attributed to our success so far. And so those would be a strong drive and alignment from the executive to complete this work. So that's something that's very important for us, all the way down from Mark Little. He's talking about making sure that we've got the right model in place, that we're driving the right organizational structures, and we're driving the right principles and thinking into the organization for what it is that we're doing. And that's given us a lot of flexibility to be able to do the second point, which is gain access to those knowledgeable business resources, which tend to be off in their own area. And frankly, they have their own jobs. This is yet another ask from an outside group trying to get somebody's time to do something when they already committed 100%, often more, to other tasks in the organization. So that's something that was critical for success. For us, a strong data practice to anchor our systems in as well. So making sure that we've got that data system in place and that we've got the resources and people that are going to be able to make that happen, and understanding how we're going to make or continue to connect data together and make sure that it's, you know, an important aspect of everything that you do. It's baked into what's happening. From an integration perspective, it's great if you've got the data all in the systems and you can create some reports, and there's probably some tools that directly access it, but really you need to be able to create that integration practice as well to pull that information out and be able to push it into different areas in the organization. And then we've got the common architectural language as well. So that also was key for making us, you know, for our ability to be able to have those conversations across the organization and to have the discussions about, you know, which kinds of objects we should create in what spaces. So, you know, when we're talking about constructing the digital enterprise twin, I just wanted to review sort of everything that you'd seen so far before we move on to questions and other pieces. So we talked about the construction. So again, that critical success factor, I think, get alignment for the executive. Make sure that you've got everybody singing off the same song sheet, so to speak. Because you're going to need to engage those resources and talk to the people that you need to, the right people in the business that really have the information that you need. You've got to understand and model your business value chain to put those things together. You've got to understand your assets and the flow of material through them. So put those, you know, make sure that you can model those with the business people as well, and that you understand what's moving from end to end. What is your output product? What are all the inputs and everything that has to happen in between? You've got to understand your people, process, data, and technology landscapes. So, you know, what is happening inside of your organization? What does that mean? And then you've got to be able to hook up the modeled landscape to relevant real world metrics and systems. So where are you going to pull that data from? What's the right level of data? Where is that aggregated to inside of the model? And how do you feel it contributes to the actual value chain that you're trying to represent? And then create and catalog change and demand models. So you've got to create these the representations of how models are actually changing. So first at the EA level, and then in more detailed levels as you move through from EA to SA to into the actual developers that are putting those things in place. So I think those are the critical steps that we talk about in construction. You might have heard me mention as well some core principles as we were going through that talk. And so inside of here, only go so specific into your modeling where your concepts will remain relatively stable. So that's an important part. If you think about it as a mathematical model, you know, and you've got a function at the top, you've got a number of individual parameters inside of it, and then a number of variables that you're trying to adjust for. When you think about how you tie all of those things together, if you're always changing the constituent elements of it, you never really get a reliable forecast that's going to tell you something into the future. That equation needs to be stable, and then you need to measure its predictive accuracy against the actuals that come back. And so that's the key when you're trying to put these things together, is make sure that you're at that right level. Leverage existing data and industry models where you can to drive, you know, common language. I think that's another one when we talk about the industry models. So it's not just like ArchiMate itself, I guess, is an industry meta model. So I would say that's one way and one piece of the puzzle, but that ADRM component that I was talking about as well, it can really define those high level concepts. So how do you abstract up people? Is it employee? Is it contractor? Are those two concepts that are different? You know, how do you start to aggregate that into something that makes sense? So like ADRM, the suggestion for trying to tie all of those things together is to call it a party. And it doesn't matter then if it's a group, an individual, an organization, or a bunch of different elements inside of there. So you can see sort of a natural flow of how that gets aggregated up through the stack in terms of that data representation. So that's important for those language concepts. And you probably need to land on some common definitions as well. So having a good starting place with industry is good, but then make sure you work with your business so that everybody's on the same page about what the language is that you're using. So continually show visibility to the organization. So making sure that we've got those reports, that we're showing that back. We want to build that advocacy with the actual organization itself, and that's only going to help. That's only going to help with the adoption of the actual tool. Because like we know, I'm sure we've all been through many of these processes in the past where, you know, it seems like a continual process of reorganization where you go in, you know, we talk about, oh, we need to redefine those processes. We're going to reorganize some groups and shift some different things. And it seems like it's often, we lose things along the way as we're moving through that. And so I think a key one here is to build that advocacy, build things into the system, make sure that people can find the value, and make sure that you're showing that output. So Abacus's enterprise portal is one aspect of that. I would argue we've actually been using Power BI as well, and leveraging the API set that Abacus has provided. And that's been really successful for making some more sort of published reports as well. So that's been good. Another aspect that we've been looking at is when we need to do more advanced graph and path analysis and other things. We've been using Neo4j to do exports of the information into those data sets. So continuing to figure out how you can leverage the base capture that happens inside of Abacus, the portal that already exists inside of there, and the visualization tools that are there, and then and how you're able to then get access to that information through those API components as well, to be able to represent it either in mashups of other information with Power BI or with something like a Neo4j or other tools that can help with some of that path analysis stuff. From there, I mean, for Suncor, our next steps are just continuing to make this thing live. We've got to continue to work with the business groups to update and maintain and improve the information over time. We're working right now through making sure that we've got good data quality metrics. So how do we ask questions of the data to make sure that we've got the right information there? So we're going through a little bit of an exercise, for instance, just to say, okay, if we were expecting to see applications mapped, like physical applications mapped on one side against a value chain, these were the ones we would think would participate. How does that actually look when we tie that through the model and look at the full analysis of how those things are linked together? So being able to do some data quality stuff around that is important to make sure you can build confidence in the model. So that's what we're working on there. But just always, of course, looking to add more information to the model that makes sense. So going after more systems of record that we've got around our HR, and deepening that integration that we've got with those systems. And then integrating that planning information back into Suncor's data warehouse, so we can build some more trending reports and show some change over time for what it is that we're doing and how we're affecting the landscape. Because of course, that's always one major challenge when we think about transparency is, it's easy to look around and see where you are today, but it's hard to sometimes showcase how you've been on this journey and how far you've come from where that originally was. So I think with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining me in my description of the Suncor's journey around constructing our enterprise digital twin. And I hope you found this session useful. I've got time for questions, I think. We've got quite a bit of time, so that should be good. And then, and you can, I think I heard Melissa say you can enter those in the chat, and I'll endeavor as many as I can in the time that I've got remaining. Melissa?
Yep, that's right. Thanks so much, Jeff. That was great. Really informative. Much appreciated. So we'll start off with one of our questions. Someone has asked, what are the 3 major business changes that have been made as a result of your digital twin efforts?
Okay, so I think 3 of the major business changes that have been made. I think some of the big ones that we've been talking through right now have been a shift away from the way that we were inside of our IT organization. I would say we've been managing our operations group, and this hasn't been solely with the enterprise digital twin, but of course it's all of these things are in concert with a number of changes that are happening inside of the organization. But the first one I'd say would be the shift away from a tiered or like a layered IT support model into more of a product-centric support model for what it is that we're doing. So it's carving up the existing environment, the legacy environment, being able to tie those things together, and then apportioning that out into the different areas and groups so that we can see how that's going to affect the app landscape, and how we can see duplication then across those areas as well, by thinking more about the business outcomes and how they contribute to the actual value chain, to the business and what it is that they're doing, as opposed to focusing in on just like, a functional application area and or a functional application really, and how that application is supporting some individual business units. So it's helped to really aggregate up a lot of those concepts. And that ties into another area. So that was one, I guess. On the other side, we're talking about business simplification. And so inside of our business simplification areas, we're talking right now about where we're reducing headcount and doing some things around that to streamline some of the business processes and really look at what it is that we need to do. Again, aligning back to that value stream, being very clear on what it is that we provide from beginning to end. So, so I think that's another area that we've been talking through is how the people relate back into the business areas and how they're tying together on that side. And another major, let's see, a third major area where we've been focusing in on that. I think maybe I would say on the demand modeling side from that enterprise perspective. So really when we talk about the change models, being able to see the number of objects that are impacted, like I sort of focused in on that a little bit in my presentation, but being able to focus in on the number of objects that are impacted and really generate those change maps has helped us to understand, the scope of the changes, how many objects are being touched at the same time, how many different projects are going after the same particular value elements. So a lot of that portfolio management I mean, arguably there's still lots of it that's going on in discussion as well. But we've seen specific cases where we've already been able to, put the right people in the room to have the discussion to talk about, okay, hey, are you really trying to duplicate and just go after the same value that other people are trying to go after? So yeah, I think those would be three major parts. Or three major areas that we've seen some change, or we've seen change inside of the organization that we've been able to affect. And yeah, so I mean, I would push, if you're talking about value cases and areas where you can realize it, I think those are tangible items.
Great. So somebody asked us, when you're referring to digital twin and the construction of that and everything that you all have done, are you referring to making the enterprise architecture explicit, or do you mean fully automated and integrated processes such as digital process automation, for example? They think it's likely the second point above, but also notice that you are leveraging the explicit depiction of the as is and to be enterprise architecture artifacts to plan the roadmap.
Yeah, I think I mean, like any good business person, I'm gonna leverage this thing wherever I can, and so I would say we're probably trying to do a little bit of both. So there's there's definitely some digital process automation stuff that's going on from how we're trying to pull those things together, create this fully automated model, and be able to do that the forecasting again. I think maybe where I'm just thinking through in my head. When we get through some of the, we start to think about how we're modeling and using this for sort of like forecasting and showing these change elements that are happening inside of the organization, the better quality data that we can get and the better we can tie it together to create that fully automated, like plumbing of that information into the system, the better it's going to be. Right now, we still have a bunch of manual ones. We're on this journey, right, to pull in more and more of that information. So we leverage what we can where we can. From the making the enterprise architecture explicit side, I would say we actually are doing a lot of that, like a lot of what we're doing around the communication perspective. And we talk about having that common language with the business is really trying to drive this up to that level of actual enterprise architecture and trying to get away from this concept where we get stuck into, oh, it's just about IT architects. And so I think that's, like it's just IT architects trying to do systems and other things. There is a real push there to say, okay, well, what does the organization look like? How does that tie together? How are we tying business processes? How do we tie that to people? Like that whole section that we had, the pink section, I guess I can go back to it. I have control of the screen. When we talk about this section here with the digital capabilities in the center and how we're relating all of these different things together, I mean, that really is at the business level, not so much at that IT level. So maybe if that doesn't answer the question, I mean, feel free to chime in with a follow-up.
Thanks, Jeff. And you mentioned common language, and we actually have a question related to that. I mean, obviously the common language can vary between business teams and industry. And, as this person mentioned, getting agreements can be really time consuming. Did you all kind of take an industry standard approach, or did you kind of try to get buy-in from all of the different teams? Or, essentially, can you just talk a little bit more through how you got to that common language?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely can take a long time. Well, and if you're trying to create a syllabus or, like do something custom, we often refer to how we've Suncorized things, like taken concepts and models and really tried to make them our own. And then, of course, that I feel oftentimes that just leads to a lot of confusion and difficulty onboarding people, right? So for us, we did try to leverage those models as much as possible, leverage like industry models and be able to have that common language that way. I think the big thing that helped us was just being able, we're coming at it from a high enough level with like from our CEO and our chief transformation officer being the people who are really like championing this and saying, no, this is the language. This is the things that we're going to do. These are the things that we're going to say. And having a lot of that top down push to have that, like to understand about what the common language is helped us a lot. And so that's why I would underscore like a lot of it was, okay, we could show that there's a good reason to use the industry language. And so we should just keep doing that. And that means that IT needs to, IT needs to step back a little bit. We need to pick up some of the common models. So ArchiMate has done most of that for us. I will say it's not a perfect process. It's not like we've achieved 100% success and everybody says everything exactly the same all the time. I can point to one right on this slide. This application capabilities thing is actually logical application components. And the challenge we had there was sort of as we brought in some consultants to do some work, and those consultants, when they came in, they had their own language and methodology around that particular term and what it meant to them. And so we ended up having to adopt it just because it sort of got pushed through the model. So I'm hoping to adjust that as we move forward. But generally, everybody's been pretty receptive to, like as soon as we've gone in and just said like, hey, here's how we want to talk about these things. Here's what the common language actually is. It's ArchiMate, it's facilities, it's these different individual components that we're talking about. We've been able to be, fairly successful in driving through and getting the modeling done that we need to create these predictive models.
That's great. Excellent. So how do you handle the situation of models being out of date quickly? Is there any automation to build them? So quite a challenge.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, I think so. Part of it is identifying. I mean, there is a lot of work just to maintaining and updating those models. So we're building a lot of the as-is models right now. These change models, as they sort of move through, are identifying where there's changes inside of the individual elements. And so that's all this stuff that's happening on the inside. And of course, there's different levels of detail as well. So as we start to drive down from these high level objects, which these are very much like at an EA level, like we're talking about just some of the business concepts and what are the apps and the functions that the apps need to actually provide. And as we get through, of course, the solution architecture, it's going to drive to much more detail inside of what's there. And frankly, it may be the case that it's too detailed for some of the stuff that we need to do. So it may be important for implementation and putting it in place, but we may choose to incorporate those models, or we may choose to just leave those models aside with the additional detail, but make sure that that high level is correct. And I think that goes back to, again, that comment about the mathematical, the idea of the mathematical model and making sure that you can describe them in concepts that are stable. If the parameters are always shifting, then it makes it hard for you to actually do any comparison across those individual items. And unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for how do you know, which I feel is the follow-up question, how do you know you got to the right level? I just feel like the litmus test is if you're seeing things change all the time at that top level, then it probably is too detailed for what you need. We know we're seeing this right now, and we've been doing some stuff in our platform spaces where we've created these capability hierarchies. And inside of these capability hierarchies, you can see that the lowest layers are too detailed. Like they're starting to talk about application components and behaviors and processes. And we need to take that up one level and sort of repurpose those components, because it's all good information. It just maybe was captured in the wrong way.
Great, that's helpful. So as you know, of course, at any initial stage of a program or changes that are needed in a business, we often don't have very many details, but management will typically want estimates on time and money. Do you have any advice for how to handle that kind of situation?
Yeah. Do I have advice? Well, come on. All sorts. So inside of here, actually in the motivation models here, we actually do represent the value that we think is going to be achieved by it. Now, albeit, I mean, we go through a process, I'm sure, like most other organizations, as you said, everybody wants to put some dollars on it. How valuable is it? How much is it going to cost? What's the return? And you have to be able to generate those with the actual business themselves. I find that's more challenging in the IT space when you're talking about either risk mitigation or IT spend that might be sort of like a cross-organizational support structure. That's when you get into a little bit, it definitely gets a little more difficult. But coming up with these estimations and these models is sort of a key high-level value that you attribute to the top. And then as you create these individual components, I mean, Abacus has the financial calculators and the abilities to do these roll-ups as well for the individual pieces as they tie down into here. So I would just recommend using those actual calculations, those roll-ups, and inside of Abacus, of course, you can leverage the script engines that are there as well to aggregate that information back up. So that's how I would pull together the individual cost. Again, speaking to that, like pick the right level. You know, you're totally right. You're not going to know everything that you've got at the beginning. The real trick will be just to describe it at a high enough level that you can sort of, you know, that you can put your estimate to it. So in this particular one, they're talking about location management as a particular application capability that exists. And that so that location management is something that we do have today, but we know that they're going to change it in some way. So we're going to change it by creating, well, see, we've got our own jargon in here, RTK, some GNSS application, reference station apps and stuff like that. So as we tie those things together, we could say each one of these represents, you know, this is an application. You could either probably go get a budgetary estimate if you knew the applications that are in that space, or another possibility would be just to go and sort of say like, well, generally application, like Gartner actually could provide some of those particular items as well. If you're a member there, you could look at some of their vendor assessments, and they can often give you like pricing ideas or what those quotes look like for what might be applicable to that particular area. And then from there, it's sort of like, okay, well, you know, if you know it's got to be highly available, you know, if you're talking to the business and they're like, oh my God, it's super critical, we need to have it all the time, you're going to be driving down into that next layer where you're going to say like, okay, well, what's going to be, you know, double redundant infrastructure. So you need to make sure you've got 2 sets of it. So multiply everything by 2 or multiply everything by 4. I know estimation is more of an art than a science in a lot of ways. So I try not to get too specific on that side. And I think that's a challenge too. When these models get created at that high level, especially from a business demand perspective, they're often getting created by those EAs. So, but it's enterprise architects and Suncor. And so when that, and they might be 2 or 3 years down the road for when the actual project's going to be instantiated. So you do the best you can at the time, and you know that somebody's going to come back and revisit it. You know, that iterative gated process or an iterative process where you're going to get more and more clarity as you start to execute the project is going to be the thing that's going to drive ultimately those actual cost numbers for where this is going to, you know, sort of end up.
Great. So speaking of money and cost, what value do you see in having a digital twin with respect to IT cost reductions?
Yeah. So inside of so from an IT cost reduction perspective, like I said, I mean, I sort of outlined that our shift to a more product-centric model for delivering some of those IT assets. And I think that's one that has helped because it's helped to define better because it's defined by the business outcomes, and it's defined the business partners that you've got then on that side to be able to pair with have a much better understanding of how they're achieving that value. It sort of moved us away from that IT-centric monolithic space to something that's actually closer to how we're providing that, you know, how we're actually providing the business value. And so by doing that and being able to partner with them, you should be able to, you know, you can get a better understanding of what is happening on that side. I want to make sure I answered that question entirely. Can you repeat it?
Sure. It was, what value do you see in having a digital twin with respect to IT cost reductions?
Yeah. Okay. So that's the first part. So identifying redundancy and making sure that we've got those things in place. Also streamlining ownership. So just making sure that you understand which pieces are there and who owns those individual pieces. The hookups we've got with ServiceNow have been actually invaluable for some of the app rationalization processes that we've been going through right now from a cost reduction perspective. And so that tie-in between the operational data in the as-is system, being able to see who's been flagged as, you know, business owners, and being able to tie back to the records so that you can go and, you know, look inside of that actual system to see where the tickets are and other ones has really helped to assess what's been happening. And that tie back then to the logical application components on the other side, because we now have an identified, like we call them platforms, but we have an identified platform that owns a particular suite of applications that is mandated to provide a set of capabilities. Those capabilities are represented, you know, aggregated into these logical app constructs, and then those physical app constructs that sit underneath are actually, you know, that are surfaced from ServiceNow are actually then all tied in together. And you can quickly spot like, oh, okay, well, they're both providing that capability and they both are serving this logical application, need. What is the, what's the value of having both of these? Where can we get rid of one? So that kind of, I think that redundancy thing is the biggest piece. And then just making sure that you've got full understanding in terms of what is in each person's portfolio. So some of the catalogs and those kinds of shifts.
Great, that's helpful. Just wanted to, we've got one more question right now, but if there are any other last minute questions, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A chat module. But the last question we have at this point, Jeff, is, has a creation of a digital twin helped with decision making at an organizational level? For example, assisting with mergers and acquisitions or other things?
I would like to say, I would hope so. When we talk about, well, and I would say from we're taking over our operations for Syncrude right now. So we're actually going through a merger process at the moment, and being able to leverage the digital twin just to identify like the difference between the two organizations, right? So if you think about the current state of Suncor around the outside with the change state of adding all of these additional components inside, you can quickly identify where, well, are you going to change something outside to align the two different applications and make sure that you're using the same operational processes? Are you are you going to replace one with the other? Is it something that you're just going to onboard and move across and just take ownership of it? And some of those individual pieces as well. So from a mergers and acquisitions perspective, being able to merge those lists together and being able to see what comes together to make that happen has been something that's valuable. I'm trying to think from a value chain perspective, there also would be using it for the process mapping side of it too. So where you could see like, well, what are the actual processes that we've got on both sides? I think that's something for the future. I don't think they've tackled that yet. They're more worried about the IT operational asset takeovers right now. So those have been the individual pieces, but just showing where there's alignment that needs to happen and building that over time is something that's important for us.